Dear friends, we in the Philippine Embassy in Paris join the nation in commemorating the 125th anniversary of the martyrdom of Dr. Jose Rizal. The Embassy would like to share its offering to you, our dear viewers, to introduce our national hero to those who do not yet know him, and further deepen the narrative of his life to those who do. The video which we are about to share is largely based on the book The Philippines and France, Discovery, Rediscovery, which chronicles the development of the diplomatic relations between the Philippines and France and the personalities that contributed to its evolution. Part 2 of this book recounts Jose Rizal's sojourn in France, which was brought to life by vlogger and social media influencer Miss D. Apilado. As you will soon discover, France made an indelible impact on the life and psyche of our national hero. This was reflected in his writings and letters during this period. While we may never know how much his experiences in France shaped Rizal, these undoubtedly molded his views on freedom and the price that it exacted. While a century and a quarter has passed since Rizal penned the words to his Mi Ultimo Adios, the verses continue to reverberate throughout the ages. The need for his spirit of sacrifice and love for the motherland has not diminished, but is all the more required to move the nation forward. May we all imbibe his words and, like him, say to our beloved Philippines in his last farewell, "With gladness I give you my life, sad and repressed, and were it more brilliant, more fresh, and at its best, I would still give it to you for your happiness. Je vais joyeux de te donner ma triste et sombre vie, et fut-elle plus brillante, plus fraîche, plus fleurie, je la donnerai encore pour toi, je la donnerai pour ton bonheur." This project is our tribute to the man whose blood watered the seed of what was to be our great nation. Join us in remembering Rizal's greatness and heroism as we retrace his footsteps in France.
France is one of the well-known countries that has made a significant contribution in the life of Dr. Jose Rizal. Indeed, France is among the countries that we tend to encounter in history of many nations.
As we go along this tour, we will explore the connection of France to the life of Dr. Jose Rizal.
In the mid-19th century, many affluent Filipinos went to Europe to study and do business. Spain was considered as the natural choice destination for these Filipinos. However, geographical proximity eventually brought many of the Filipinos based in Spain to France, such as intellectuals, artists, and businessmen in the names of Jose Rizal, Juan Luna, and the Pardo de Taveras. Many of the Filipinos who found their way to Paris came from rich backgrounds and were able to afford the high cost of living. For Rizal's generation of Filipinos, the benefits of living in France were the knowledge acquired and the principles imbibed: liberty, equality, and fraternity that eventually influenced the Philippine Revolution. In 1882, the then 21-year-old Jose Rizal boarded French cargo passenger steamship SS Gemna and sailed to Europe to study medicine. His marvelous and colorful trip to France started when he first set foot in Marseille, the southern port city, on June 13, 1882. Rizal is one of the few Filipinos who braved the long sea travel and the great distance between France and Spain. Little did he know that a remarkable experience awaited him in France. The young Rizal, who was fondly called Pepe by his family, was fascinated by French culture. He read the grand masterpieces of Alexandre Dumas, Voltaire, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Victor Hugo, and works by other French authors and great thinkers. Upon his arrival in France, Rizal stayed at Le Grand Hôtel Noailles du Marseille, located at 62 La Canebière, from June 13 to 15, 1882. This hotel was one of the most luxurious establishments in the city at that time. Rizal keenly described his room and noted that this hotel was one of the best he had stayed in. Many prominent personalities in the fields of politics, literature, and arts stayed in this hotel, such as German composer Richard Wagner, the then Duke of Edinburgh, Prince Albert, son of Queen Elizabeth, and the French writer Guy de Maupassant. After his quick stay in Marseille, he then proceeded to his ultimate destination in Spain.
Rizal's second trip to France started on June 17, 1883, and it lasted more than 2 months, during which, as he wrote to his parents, that he was impressed by the French culture. He first stayed at Hôtel de Paris.
The purpose of his stay was to improve his medical training by visiting Paris's hospitals and faculty of medicine. The young Rizal would visit the Laennec Hospital to observe how the French doctor there, Dr. Niquez, treated his patients. Jose was amazed at the medical procedures he had witnessed. Another one he visited often was the Hôpital Lariboisière, where he met an old classmate from the Ateneo de Manila, Felix Pardo de Tavera, of the illustrious Pardo de Tavera family of Manila, who was then training to become a pediatric surgeon while honing his craft as a sculptor. Rizal would go to various gardens, museums, and shops in Paris. In his letters to his family, he mentioned visits to the Louvre, Bois de Boulogne, Jardin d'Acclimatation, Printemps, and Le Bon Marché. Now we see a portion of a late 19th century map of the 9th arrondissement of Paris, showing the residences where Dr. Jose Rizal stayed. Today, the street names and buildings in these areas retain much of their essence. These would have been what Rizal saw during his time. Because Jose was a prolific writer, he often sent letters to his parents in the Philippines. He gladly shared with them his musings from all his excursions and visits throughout France.
Due to tight finances, Rizal moved from Rue de Maubeuge to the Latin Quarter, where the cost of living was cheaper.
Le Quartier Latin, or Latin Quarter, was named this way because of the university students inhabitants who studied and spoke Latin in La Sorbonne and other universities there. The Sorbonne, the oldest university in France, had been the most important university of the country at that time, and continues to be a prominent one to this day. Also situated in the Latin Quarter is the Pantheon, France's temple and final resting place for its greatest writers, scientists, generals, churchmen, and politicians. Interred there are Victor Hugo, Voltaire, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Émile Zola, Alexandre Dumas, Pierre et Marie Curie.
Now, the Best Western Aramis Saint-Germain Hotel, Rizal would stay at an apartment on the 4th floor and 124 Rue de Rennes, owned by a certain Madame de Jardin.
It was strategically near the Luxembourg Gardens and the Luxembourg Palace, where the French Senate held office since 1879. During this time, Rizal often visited the Hôtel Dieu, the oldest hospital in Paris, and also had a wander in the gardens and museums nearby. La Cité Fleurie was created from materials gathered after the dismantling of the Pavillon de l'Alimentation of the Paris World Exposition of 1878. La Cité Fleurie is renowned because of its occupants, French sculptor Auguste Rodin, French painters Pierre Roy and Paul Gauguin, as well as the Italian painter Amedeo Modigliani. It was in Luna's studio that many Filipino artists and intellectuals would gather to discuss the fate of the Philippines. Felix Resurrección Hidalgo, who was acknowledged as one of the greatest Filipino painters in the late 19th century, also occupied one of the studios at La Cité Fleurie. Rizal's financial constraints did not allow him access to the French high society, Le Grand Monde, as it was called at that time. However, he was able to establish connections with some of the French intellectual elite through his Ilustrado friends. In his sojourn in Paris, Rizal was able to make many Filipino Parisian friends. Apart from the Pardo de Taveras, Juan Luna and his brother Antonio, Rizal also became friends with fellow Filipino physicians Felipe Zamora and Joaquin Gonzalez. Gonzalez was the one who opened the door for Rizal to land an assistant ophthalmology job with Dr. Louis Duvecker.
Rizal trained under the ophthalmic surgeon Dr. Louis Duvecker in 1885, whose clinic was located at number 55 Rue du Cherche Midi. He is known to be the first to fully master the cataract surgery and was the ophthalmologist to French Empress Eugénie.
With the help of Dr. Vecker, Rizal learned various cataract surgery techniques that he later used on his mother, Teodora Alonso. Louis de Vecker's patronage opened for Rizal the doors to the best German universities, as the former was a friend of Professor Otto Becker from Heidelberg and of Rudolf Virchow from the University of Berlin. After his training with de Vecker, Rizal left Paris on February 1, 1886. For Heidelberg via Strasbourg to train under Otto Becker, where he stayed for 4 months, working at the University Eye Clinic. Subsequently, Dr. Rizal came to Paris for a week in September 1888 to search for documentation on the Philippines in the Bibliothèque Nationale, which was part of the continuation of his scientific edition of Antonio de Morga's Sucesos de las Islas Filipinas. Sucesos de las Islas Filipinas was said to be one of the most important works on the history of the Spanish colonization of the Philippines. He also used the time to grace the birthday celebration of Andres, Juan Luna's son. In January 1889, he worked on a proposal that took advantage of the opportunities offered by the holding of a universal exposition in Paris starting on May 6, 1889, while he was still working on Morga's book. He planned to gather members for the Association Internationale des Philippinistes, of Europe-based scholars working on the Philippines, into an academic society. He proposed to use the society to organize an international conference during the Paris World Exposition. Rizal arrived in Paris on March 19, 1889, to to prepare for the conference and consult documents in the Bibliothèque Nationale, to complete his work on Morga Sucesos, and to attend the World Exposition.
Rue Saulnier. This has been Rizal's home while attending the World Exposition in Paris from March 19 to 28, 1889.
Perhaps the most important and least known fact in the history of Philippine participation to the Paris expositions and salons is that the Philippine national hero, Jose Rizal, joined Luna and Pardo de Tavera in the list of Filipinos who exhibited in the highly coveted Salon de Paris in 1889. Upon his arrival, he formed the Kidlat Club 162, where Filipinos who came to Paris could meet each other. Among the members were Antonio and Juan Luna, Lauro de Mayuga, Baldomero Rojas, Gregorio Aguilera, Fernando Canong, Gregorio Pautu, and Julio Lorente. It was organized by Rizal simply to bring together young Filipinos in Paris so they could enjoy their stay in the city during the International Exposition. Later on, it was replaced by Los Indios Bravos. Dr. Rizal had grand plans to organize a conference on the Philippines for the ethnology section of the Leiden Ethnographic Museum, but these plans remained in limbo. The postponement of the workshop was mostly due to Rizal's work on Morga, his regular contributions to La Solidaridad, and his preoccupation with the outlines of a new novel, a sequel to Noli Me Tangere, which later became known as El Filibusterismo. It was also here that Rizal thought of planning his translation of Ferdinand Blumentritt's monographs. Rizal's life in France was indeed not easy. He moved frequently in and around Paris from the months of March until July of 1889. Room rental prices skyrocketed at the height of the World Exposition.
By April 1889, Rizal transferred to the Hôtel de la Pensée, now known as Hôtel des Arts.
In late April 1889, Rizal stayed at the Hôtel du Printemps for a few days where he was able to complete the manuscript for his translation of Ferdinand Blumentritt's monographs. While staying in 10 Rue du Louvois, Rizal exchanged letters with Blumentritt expressing his deep gratitude for his unwavering support for the Filipino cause. On July 4, 1889, Rizal stayed at the Hôtel du Rhin at the New Haven, where he initially took the train bound for the coastal town of Dieppe. The train he took passed through the French towns of Vernon and Rouen on his way to London for a short visit. Upon his return, Rizal stayed in an apartment on 45 Rue du Maubeuge, owned by Valentin Ventura,
who came from a well-known and wealthy family from Bacolor, Pampanga.
Valentin Ventura, known in Philippine history as a reformist and a member of the propaganda movement, was the one who provided financial assistance for the printing of Jose Rizal's El Filibusterismo in 1891. To express his gratitude, Rizal gave Ventura the original manuscript of El Filibusterismo after its publication and distribution. It was eventually acquired by the National Library. Dr. Jose Rizal's love life is no longer hidden from our knowledge. His love interests and adventures served as inspiration for some of his writings on love. One of the most prominent families Rizal made friends with were the Busteds, who he first met in 1889 and were much wealthier than the Pardo de Taveras. The Busteds had founded a prosperous trading company in Singapore at the end of the 1820s. This company, which continues to exist today, was in fact the one which gave birth to the Singaporean conglomerate Keppel Group. He stayed with them in their Villa Eliada in Biarritz in February and March of 1891. It was in Biarritz that Rizal completed the El Filibusterismo on March 29, 1891, before he was able to publish it with Valentin Ventura's help. In April 1891, Rizal stayed in the Grand Hotel for a few days to revise some chapters in his El Filibusterismo novel. At present, the Grand Hotel is now the Intercontinental Paris Le Grand Hotel, retaining much of its old grandeur.
Aside from his previous apartment, Rizal also stayed in another residence rented by Valentin Ventura.
In mid-October 1891, Rizal made his way to Marseille and stayed at the Hôtel du Castille at du Luxembourg. It was in Marseille that he boarded the SS Melbourne to Hong Kong on his way back to the Philippines in 1891. Marseille was where Rizal first set foot in Europe, and little did he know, it would also be the last city in Europe that he would ever visit in his lifetime. Although Rizal traveled to many countries and places on the course of his travel across Europe, France was among the few countries that left an indelible mark on him. In France, he wrote a series of articles for La Solidaridad, wrote 1/4 of his first novel, Noli Me Tangere, and completed the manuscript of its sequel, El Filibusterismo. These two novels, Noli Me Tangere and El Filibusterismo, were Rizal's most notable works that provided the spark that ignited the Philippine Revolution by opening the eyes of Filipinos to the ills of their society. On December 31st, 1896, L'Univers, a Catholic newspaper, announced in a few lines and without giving any explanation that Rizal had been sentenced to death, and that on December 29, 1896, he entered into chapel to prepare for eternal life, assisted by Jesuit priest. Several other newspapers also reported on his untimely death. Jean Jaurès, a French socialist leader, provided the most moving commentary on Rizal's life. Jaurès was the founder and editor of the French daily newspaper L'Humanité and wrote a foreword to Henri Turot's book on Aguinaldo, to which he focused on the life and death of Rizal, which according to Jean Jaurès are undoubtedly one of the most moving episodes of the history of mankind. The French were amazed at Rizal's demonstrated prowess in many respects. As a writer and poet, his printed works became part of the social-cultural discourse of the French. Rizal's life story was so moving that it made its way into a school book for elementary French schools at that time. It cannot be denied that during his short time in the country, Rizal gained many experiences during his stay in France. Unbeknownst to many, Rizal left his own mark in France that to this day is still recognized. Following Rizal's execution, 5 historical markers have since been installed in places where Rizal stayed by the Philippine government in cooperation with the city government of Paris and the local town halls of Paris 6th, 9th, and 13th district, as well as the Filipino-French community.
In this apartment also, you can see the symbol commemorating his 100th death anniversary on December 30th, 1896. In this house is where he stimulated the Philippine national spirit through his books and writings.
This marker was installed for the Philippine patriotic artists and intellectuals Los Indios Bravos, who gathered in 1880s at the studio of Juan Luna. Albeit the fact that Rizal stayed in France for a shorter period than in Spain, he still has become an icon of history in the lives of the French Filipino community. Dr. Jose Rizal is the national hero of the Philippines. He is a doctor, a poet, a writer, an artist, a linguist, and a man ahead of his time in his advocacy for women's right to education. It was on April 7, 1999, that the Mairie du Paris, or the City Hall of Paris, agreed to the proposal of the Philippine Embassy and named this small part of Paris in honor of Rizal. Jose Rizal's life and times in Paris is fittingly memorialized here.
Place Jose Rizal and the historical markers in France serve as a lasting reminder of a great man, or in French, un grand homme, who once walked these same streets and brought back home to his beloved Philippines the ideals of democracy. It was a pleasure reliving a part of Philippine history by retracing the footsteps of Jose Rizal in France. We invite you to revisit these important sites in your future travels.